Hey, what's up guys? This is Ben here. Today I want to talk to y'all about tendonitis and how it almost ended my career in drumming. And I want to share with you the story about how I got it 2 times and how I managed to overcome it, and things that I recommend that you can do to help yourself if you do have it, and things you can do to help prevent it. For those of you who don't have tendonitis, this video will also be informative in telling you how you can prevent from actually getting the injury. Before we begin, I do want to state that I am not a licensed doctor or medically trained at all. So any advice that you take from this video and that you put into action and that you interpret or misinterpret is solely at your own risk. So first thing I want to talk about is what exactly is tendonitis. Tendonitis is the inflammation of the tendon that connects the muscle to the bone, and it's caused by repetitive motion. So you'll hear a lot about an injury that's known as tennis elbow, which is basically the same thing. So in tennis, when you're swinging the racket, you can develop this tendonitis in your elbow, and that's just from the repetitive motion. And so same thing with drumming. When we're drumming, we use our arms and mostly our wrists and fingers. In this case, my tendonitis injury was in my wrist. And so that's where I developed my tendonitis, from repetitive motion strain. So let me tell you guys about the 2 times that I got it and the 2 different ways I approached healing it when I did have it. So the first time I had tendonitis was in 2009. During the time I was auditioning for drum and bugle corps, and I had gotten a contract to march with the Boston Crusaders. This was probably around March or April 2009. So we were finishing up our weekend-long camp, and we were doing a marching block, and we were switching drums around because we were still auditioning people. And I just wanted to still play my best during the audition. So during one of the marching blocks, we were switching drums in and out, and I had gotten a drum that was the wrong height of where I am. So the drum was seated really high on my body, and I had to kind of lift my hands up high and play like this. So what had happened was I was playing full out 8 on a hand, which is an exercise we were doing, and I noticed something was funny after a while, but I didn't know what, and we just finished and they were sending us off to dinner. So once we came back from dinner, I headed back out and I went to a drum, and my wrist was done. Like, it was not moving, and it was super painful, and I had no idea what had just happened. So I sat out the rest of the camp, and we iced it and we bandaged it up. And anyways, the camp finished and we went home, and that was the last camp before move-ins. So I got home and I went to visit a doctor. And so I got the diagnosis from the doctor. He was like, it's tendonitis. And I was like, okay, so what can we do? And he told me, stop drumming. During that time, I also had juries to finish up because the school year was wrapping up. And yeah, I had juries coming up, and drum corps. Like, I just made a drum corps, and this was my rookout season, which means after this year I would be too old to march and I can't do it anymore. So to me, stopping drumming was not an option. The doctor also told me to take double doses of ibuprofen for 2 weeks, and then he told me to ice it. So I did those things, but it didn't really help at all. The ibuprofen just kind of like masked the pain, but it didn't actually cure the pain. And then icing kind of helped with inflammation, but every time I drummed, the pain would come back. Now, some of you have not had tendonitis, and I just want to describe what exactly tendonitis feels like. I've had a lot of students in the past, after I've told them this story, maybe like a couple weeks or a month or two later, they'll come to me and say, hey, I think I have tendonitis. Well, I want to say that if you have tendonitis, you will know like straight out right away. It's definitely not a guessing game. Okay, so the key thing is that it's super painful. So I want to use an analogy. I would describe it as it feels like there's a knife inside my wrist as I'm drumming. That's what tendonitis feels like. Now, to be honest, I've never had a knife stabbed through my wrist, but I would imagine if I was drumming and a knife was stabbed through my wrist and I kept playing, that's what it would feel like. So when you have tendonitis, when you're drumming, it is super painful. And so what it ended up becoming was my favorite activity in the world all of a sudden became my least favorite activity in the world because of how much intense physical pain it was to actually drum. Okay, so I had juries coming up and I had this drum corps thing. So first thing was first, I finished up my juries somehow. I kind of like just bandaged up my right hand and I learned my mallet solo and all my timpani piece and my snare drum piece, played the jury, passed, everything was fine. The school year ended, then I had maybe like a week and I had to make a decision whether or not I was going to go march that summer or not. So to me, that was something I'd been working up to for the longest time, and I had been practicing all last summer in 2008. I would go to the park and practice like several hours a day, and this was just something that I've been working towards, and to not go, it was such a difficult decision that I just really had to go. So I told myself, okay, let's go out there for 1 week, and if it's really bad enough and I can't do well, then I'm just gonna go home. So I flew out there and I survived that first week. It was terrible, but yeah, I pushed through and I got through the whole season. So the way I did that was the entire time I was there, I basically just spent the summer changing my technique. So this motion in my wrist, that was what was causing the most pain. And so what I did was I bought this wrist guard. I forget what it's called, but here's a picture of it. And so that's me marching with the Boston Crusaders, and I have this wrist guard. And at first I was wearing it to where it was covering my whole wrist and restricting the motion, but that actually made things worse because now my wrist was working double time. So the best solution for me at that time was to put it in a spot where it put pressure right on the hinge of my wrist, and somehow that kind of helped alleviate the pain just a little bit. It didn't completely go away. So because I couldn't do this motion, I instead the whole summer spent the entire time trying to switch to using only my fingers to play and my arm. So I'm not sure if anybody that was marching or teaching there noticed that I did that, but I mean, it worked, and it was still painful though to play, and yeah, it was pretty rough summer, but it was one of the best summers because of the struggle I had to push through. Luckily, towards the end of the season, the last 2 weeks, my hand felt a lot better, and I was drumming a lot better, kind of back to the level that I was drumming. But yeah, again, the whole time that I was marching that summer, I was probably operating definitely not at 100%, that's for sure. And my favorite activity in the world all of a sudden became like my least favorite activity because of the amount of physical pain I was in. But I pushed through it and came out on the other side. And yeah, after that summer, I went on and did PASIC, and things were looking fine with my wrist as long as I wasn't turning it in this motion. We went on to play PASIC snare ensemble that year, and it was great. So fast forward now, this is 2012 or 2013. Around this time, I've decided to try to pursue a career in drum set performance. So during this time, because I'd spent the last 10 years studying and practicing marching percussion to be able to do drum corps, now I was switching instruments and going into a completely different genre of music. So studying drum set at the time, I had this bright idea this one week that I would like triple my practice time. And so I went from practicing maybe like 2 or 3 hours a day, and this one week I tried to do like 8 hours every day. That was a completely terrible idea, and I don't recommend anybody increase their practice time by like 3 or 4 times their normal rate of what they're doing. Because after 2 days, my wrist totally gave out, and I knew I had tendonitis once again. This time the pain was more focused around this area of my wrist, and it was just kind of like this dull, lingering pain the whole time. And most of it was because when you play drum set, there's a lot of repetitive motion if you're playing jazz, if you're playing that ride cymbal, or if you're playing any of the modern styles, you'll be playing a lot of hi-hat. So yeah, at the time I was just starting gigging, and I was playing a couple of gigs in town, but again, it was very painful, and I thought the strategy I used before, just pushing through the pain and eventually it will go away, I thought that was going to work again because it worked the first time. Let's see if it will work the second time, right? So after doing that for maybe like 5 or 6 months, I suddenly knew that this was not going to work. I also went and saw several doctors, like 2 or 3 doctors. I got an MRI. Everyone told me the same thing. You have tendonitis, take ibuprofen, stop drumming. Every single one of those doctors told me that same thing. So I know some of you might be working as a drummer right now or a percussionist, and to me, again, that was just not an option because this is how I make my living, is playing and also teaching. So at the time I was teaching a full load of students, probably about like 40 percussion students a week, and I noticed that teaching that many students and playing at the same time, that kind of made things even worse with the tendonitis. So one thing I want to suggest is, if you do have an injury or tendonitis, or if you don't, try to not play the whole time when you're teaching, because that can add to the injury, especially if you're teaching like a lot of students per week and you're spending a lot of hours in there. You do need to let your body rest, and your body can only do so much. That's just my suggestion. Okay, so at this time, after seeing all the doctors, I decided to take a whole year off from drumming to recover. So it was at this time, after I'd seen all the doctors and they gave me my options of stopping drumming, I just had to find a different solution. So I went online and I started doing some research, and I stumbled across a video by this drummer. So in this video, he suggests using this bucket method where you put your hand in ice for, I think it was like 3 minutes, and then you put your hand in warm to hot water for about 1 minute. So I was doing that 3 times every day, so it would be like a 12-minute process. And that was, doing that bucket thing was probably the longest 12 minutes of every day. I think it was helping a little bit. So if you are thinking about doing that strategy, I think it does help, but I'm not entirely sure. So there's that. Okay, after that, I decided to start exercising my wrist, doing like strength training, and then I was doing like archery at some point because I felt like that was helping my wrist a bit, and like some rock climbing. So one thing I would suggest that I didn't know at the time was that if you have an injury, and this sounds obvious, but for me, I was just trying to heal as quick as I can. But if you are trying to heal as quick as you can, what's really going to help is to not agitate your injury. So before you can actually strengthen anything, you actually have to let your injury heal. Now I know that's very difficult because at the time, taking a year off from drumming, that was probably one of the most difficult years for me. So you're probably, if you're going through an injury similar, and drumming is like your livelihood or is your passion, you're probably going to struggle with taking time off from it. So what I would suggest is do that, because that's going to heal you faster. So before you can strengthen anything or begin that recovery process, the first phase is to rest and let it recover and heal. Okay, so I was doing those things, and then I stopped doing those things, and I was talking to my friend Adam one day, and he's a trombonist, and I was telling him about my problem, and he recommended that I check out this thing called Alexander technique. So I started looking for teachers in the area. So I found a teacher, and her name was Phyllis Richmond. Now at the time, Phyllis was in Dallas teaching Alexander technique, and she also does an Alexander technique workshop at UNT every year. So I contacted Phyllis, and we set up a couple appointments, and so I came in and she showed me different techniques of basically just relieving tension in the body and keeping the body in an optimal and relaxed state. So the biggest thing with Alexander technique, if you've never heard of it, it's just a technique that allows you to analyze everyday motions in your body, whether you're eating breakfast or driving or sitting at a computer or drumming or whatever it is. There are certain things you might be doing subconsciously without even thinking that are causing tension in different parts of your body. So working with her, I discovered different things that I was doing that was creating tension in my body that was not necessary. And so we worked those things out, and I can definitely say Alexander technique really helped me in refining my daily routine and things I was doing that was actually causing my wrist to be in the pain that it was. Just simple everyday things like as I was driving or eating or drumming or working on the computer. Simple things like that were actually adding to the pain in my wrist every day. So working on Alexander technique with her, that really helped me out. And one thing I would suggest is finding an Alexander technique teacher in your area if you can. There's a website, it's amsatonline.org, and you can go on there and you can find a Alexander Technique teacher in your area. So this is great not only for musicians, but also just for everyone in general. I would highly recommend it if you're experiencing any pain, whether you're working on computers or if you're driving every day, or you're playing an instrument. Definitely check that out. So after working with her for a couple of months, I also had a recommendation from my friend Sean Lynch. Now, Sean recommended that I get this book, and it's called Trigger Point Therapy Workbook by Claire Davies. And man, thank you to Sean so much, because this book was the turning point in my injury. So at this point in time, it was probably about a year since I've taken off from drumming, and I started working through the book, and within 2 weeks my injury was done. Like, I felt a lot better. My wrist was still weak, but I didn't feel the pain as much anymore. And so that's one of my highest recommendations in all this, is get that workbook, read through it carefully, and follow the instructions in there, and you can work out your injury. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the trigger point massage therapy that I use to help relieve pain and tension in my arm. So basically, in the book, when you get it, it explains the massage technique and the theory behind it. So basically, the pain that you're experiencing from tendonitis, so say for example my pain is here, that is the main pain point, but there's a referred pain point, I'm sorry, this is the referred pain point, and there's a trigger point that activates it. So the trigger point for my pain here is actually over here in this muscle, and you can actually see, I don't know if you can see it in the video, but when I'm moving my hand in this motion, not sure you can't really see it, but my muscles over here are activating. So it's here that I can develop knots from overuse. So the book talks about working out those knots that are inside those muscles that you've been using a lot. So you can use a lacrosse ball, which is what this is, and there's techniques you can use to kind of massage that out. You can also put this ball against a wall and kind of iron it out. There's also what's called a thuricane that they recommend in the book. I have one on me. I actually let a friend borrow it, one of my roommates. So he has it and the workbook right now. So I think it's been helping him a lot with his own things. So there you go. Again, another testimonial for that workbook. That book is definitely a godsend, and it's definitely helped a lot of people. So one other thing is there's like a trigger point over here somewhere that I like to massage, but again, I know where my specific trigger points are because I read through the book and I've worked them out. So I will say from this video, it's just sort of mini demonstration, but this is not the end all be all. Go ahead and pick up the book and go through it, and it will show you exactly what to do. Okay, during this time also, I went and took a lesson with Chad Wackerman. At the time I was visiting Los Angeles and trying to figure out if I wanted to move there or not. And so I was taking a lesson from him, and he helped me with a couple of different techniques to help me play more relaxed. And he also turned me to his old teacher, who teaches a lesson. If you go onto Drum Channel, there's a lesson series with Chad Wackerman's teacher. I forget his name, but I think it's like $10 and you can get the lesson, and he talks you through this technique that allows you to play a lot looser. And what I found is that when I started using this technique, gigs like 4-hour gigs, they didn't have as much strain on my hands. So if you're looking for a technique and a way to make it to where you can play really long gigs without destroying your hands, this is definitely the technique to look into. Okay, so part of stopping tendonitis is preventing it. So for those of you who don't have it, or maybe you do and you just recovered, these are a couple of tips I have for keeping your hands healthier in the long run. So stretching is super important, and it was something that helped me recover as well, and it's something I still do to prevent injury. There are a handful of stretches that you can use that will help you, and I'm going to show you a couple of them here. Okay, this first stretch is where I put my hands together like this and I kind of push down. Okay, this stretch here is where it's the same thing, but I'm just going to come up underneath. So you would hold that out for maybe a couple of seconds, and you should feel it stretching out this area of your hand. You can do this same stretch on the wall like this, and I definitely recommend doing that as well. You can also stretch out this part of your hand. If you stick your thumb into your palm like this, right, and then you turn your wrist down, you should feel the stretch up here. So I would do that in both hands. So one stretch I learned from my friend Damian Garcia. So you can't see it, but I have my cymbal bag right here. So you place a weight in one of your hands and let that weight pull down your shoulder. Then you're going to tilt your head in the opposite direction, and you should feel the stretch from your neck and your shoulder. And then just make sure you do it on both sides. One thing I wanted to talk about too is icing. So icing can help with the inflammation in your tendonitis, and so it's always a good idea to do that if you do have it. So what you do is you get a bag of ice, or I have like a bag of frozen peas here, and you would just put it on where it's painful on your wrist and just let that sit for, I don't know, 10 to 20 minutes. And for me, when I had pain in my wrist, I would do both the bottom side and the top side. So if you have two of these, you can do them at the same time. A couple of things that you might be doing daily that might be adding to the inflammation is the use of a computer. So something that I did was I invested in this ergonomic mouse, and I switched over to using a left-hand mouse instead of a right hand. So the strategy in this is that using my right hand less, it allowed me to kind of let it rest some more and not let everyday things add to the inflammation. So this left-hand mouse is super useful. I definitely recommend it. I forget what the brand is called, but I guess that's the logo there, is this heart-shaped thing. Oh, here it is. Yeah, Ergonomic AB, and this is the oyster mouse. So this is good because you can set different levels to it. So here it is as a regular mouse, and then you can prop it up one level there, and then that's the next level. So you can change what angle you want it set at, and it can also switch over to a right hand mouse if you don't want to do the left hand thing. One other thing I purchased was this ergonomic keyboard that's made by Microsoft. So I'll, sending emails every day or typing up things. This is a great way to keep your hands in a healthy position, and it will keep your hands working for the long run. And this keyboard is pretty cheap. I think I got it for like 25 bucks or something online. I can't remember, but definitely a great investment. One important thing that I also do is I just make sure I take rest days from drumming. So there's some days where I don't drum at all, especially if it was after a pretty heavy weekend of gigging. I'll take 1 or 2 days off from drumming. And a lot of people think that practicing more and more will make you better, but the older I get, the more I realize that it's the focus practice that makes you better. So it's not exactly the amount of time you put into it, but it's the amount of time that's focused. So it doesn't actually have to be much for you to improve. So make sure you take days off, and usually in those days off I have a lot of creative ideas that come to me, and those days off actually help me come back at the instrument even more inspired. So one other thing I wanted to talk about is when you're driving, it can cause a couple of different bad habits that adds to your strain. I noticed this especially when I was living in DFW and driving all to all these gigs and everything. So when you're sitting and you're driving, what I was doing was, most of the time I'll just kind of drive with one hand, and I noticed this added to the inflammation when I was driving, just the simple act of just holding the steering wheel. So trying to keep your hand in like a lower, more relaxed position will help a lot, keeping this shoulder relaxed. But the biggest thing was just switching hands, just making sure you're not using one hand more than the other, and just being aware of if you're creating tension where there shouldn't be. A big one too was like in my leg when I was driving. For some reason my left leg would be kind of tense, just keep those things in mind when you're driving, and definitely get with an Alexander technique teacher, and they can help you even more with that. Hey guys, so one other thing I want to talk about is when you're going through an injury like this, you might be under some emotional stress, especially if this is your livelihood, whether you're playing or you're teaching. Some thoughts can come up about like, why is this happening to me? Or you might start questioning if you're going to be able to continue doing this. You might be going through an identity crisis because you're like, well, if I can't drum anymore, what else am I supposed to do? I totally understand that, because it is something I did go through during this. And so the one advice I can say is, first off, if you are going through something like this, you're not the only one who's experiencing that and those thoughts. And number two is that you have to, I know it sounds kind of cliche, but you have to have kind of a positive attitude as much as you can going through this. Now you have to be realistic about your expectations, but at the same time, drumming is a risk and injuries are part of the risk. So it's something you have to be prepared for if it does happen. When I was going through it, I was still playing some gigs, and I had to kind of change my technique. I had to, instead of using my injured hand, I had to use my other hand like double time, and things like that. So yes, it sucks, but one thing I think that's not talked about a lot is during the injury is the emotional and mental strain that you're going to go through, especially if it's a serious injury. So again, you're not alone in this. There's a lot of other people who, if they're going through an injury, are having the same questions and the same fears and the same doubts. So what I can say is that you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So however you can, push through and just have hope that things are going to work out. And if things don't work out, you have to be prepared for that and be mentally strong to endure that. So if you're going through this right now, I'm with you, and it's one of the main reasons why I'm putting out this video, is because I haven't really found much support in terms of drumming injuries. So I think this is something that's sorely needed. In fact, this whole week, when I posted on my Instagram about this and I got a poll, a lot of drummers I talked to are going through similar injuries and strains in their hand. And even last night I was at the Annika Neal's clinic, and there was a drummer there who was asking her about injury that he had, and I was able to talk to him and kind of give him a similar advice that I'm giving to you now in this video. So just remember, if you're going through this, you're not alone. Try to find a support group if you can. One thing I noticed was that in sports, people expect injuries, and there's all kinds of support systems for that. With drumming, it's a little bit different because the injuries don't really come often, or they're very obscure. I don't think there's a lot of materials talking about injuries right now. So this is one of the main reasons why I want to put this out there, because it's something I went through, and I really felt like I was alone in this injury during the time. A lot of other drummers I talked to, a lot of them didn't have the injury, so they couldn't understand, and I can't blame them for that. So just know that injuries do happen. The older I get, the more I hear about these kind of injuries happening. So just know there is a community out there and a support system, and I'm one of those support people. So if you need help during your injury, please don't be afraid to reach out and contact me, and I'll be glad to assist you in any way I can. Okay, so that was a lot of things that we just covered, but I just want to summarize everything. So the main ways you can get tendonitis is from overplaying, overpracticing. So the first time I had my injury, I was playing with bad technique and I overextended my wrist, right? When I was playing on the drum that was super high, right? That was bad technique, overextension of the wrist. Plus I was practicing a lot, so yeah, already that was already pushing my limits. Okay? The second time I had tendonitis, sort of a different situation. I was just over practicing, just overdoing it, overworked the tendon. That's what caused the injury. So make sure you take rest days, make sure you don't overwork yourself, and make sure you use good technique. Right? The way you fix tendonitis is you change your technique. Make sure you're using a relaxed technique. Again, I would recommend the techniques that Chad Wackerman talks about. There's also a DVD that Tommy Igoe put out a while ago. It's called Great Hands for a Lifetime. That's something else I would look into, and something that helped me. So using that relaxed technique, that's going to really help you. So changing your technique and using Alexander technique to supplement that, keeping parts of your body relaxed that shouldn't be tense, and also using the trigger point therapy workbook. Those self-massage techniques I still use to this day, and every time I use them, they help alleviate any kind of tension or pain that I'm feeling, especially after long and hard gigs or long days of playing drums. So definitely look into that. Okay, and so preventing the injury, again, avoid overpracticing, overplaying, take rest days, make sure you ice, make sure you stretch, and make sure you're using good technique, and be cognizant of your everyday, daily routine. Okay, I think that about covers it. If you guys have any questions at all, just comment on this video or shoot me a message, and I would love to help you guys out with anything you have. All right, thanks guys.